Chapter 28 of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 28. Mr. Micawber's Gauntlet. Until the day arrived on which I was to entertain my newly found old friends, I lived principally on Dora and coffee. In my lovelorn condition my appetite languished, and I was glad of it, for I felt as though it would have been an act of perfidy towards Dora to have a natural relish for my dinner. The quantity of walking exercise I took was not in this respect attended with its usual consequence, as the disappointment counteracted the fresh air. I have my doubts too, founded on the acute experience acquired at this period of my life, whether a sound enjoyment of animal food can develop itself freely in any human subject, who is always in torment from tight boots. I think the extremities require to be at peace before the stomach will conduct itself with vigour. On the occasion of this domestic little party, I did not repeat my former extensive preparations. I merely provided a pair of soles, a small leg of mutton, and a pigeon pie. Mrs. Crupp broke out into rebellion on my first bashful hint in reference to the cooking of the fish and joint, and said with a dignified sense of injury, "No, no, sir, you will not ask me such a thing, for you are better acquainted with me than to suppose me capable of doing what I cannot do with ample satisfaction to my own feelings." But in the end a compromise was effected, and Mrs. Crupp consented to achieve this feat on condition that I dined from home for a fortnight afterwards. And here I may remark that what I underwent from Mrs. Crupp in consequence of the tyranny she established over me was dreadful. I never was so much afraid of any one. We made a compromise of everything. If I hesitated, she was taken with that wonderful disorder which was always lying in ambush in her system, ready at the shortest notice to prey upon her vitals. If I rang the bell impatiently, after half a dozen unavailing modest pulls, and she appeared at last, which was not by any means to be relied upon, she would appear with a reproachful aspect, sink breathless on a chair near the door, lay her hand upon her nankeen bosom, and become so ill, that I was glad at any sacrifice of brandy or anything else to get rid of her. If I objected to having my bed made at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, which I do still think an uncomfortable arrangement, one motion of her hand towards the same nankeen region of wounded sensibility was enough to make me falter an apology. In short, I would have done anything in an honourable way rather than give Mrs. Crupp offence, and she was the terror of my life. I bought a second-hand dumb waiter for this dinner party, in preference to re-engaging the handy young man, against whom I had conceived a prejudice, in consequence of meeting him in the Strand one Sunday morning in a waistcoat remarkably like one of mine, which had been missing since the former occasion. The young gal was re-engaged, but on the stipulation that she would only bring in the dishes, and then withdraw to the landing place beyond the outer door, where a habit of sniffing she had contracted would be lost upon the guests, and where her retiring on the plates would be a physical impossibility. Having laid in the materials for a bowl of punch, to be compounded by Mr. Micawber, having provided a bottle of lavender water, 2 wax candles, a paper of mixed pins, and a pin cushion, to assist Mrs. Micawber in her toilette at my dressing table, having also caused the fire in my bedroom to be lighted for Mrs. Micawber's convenience, and having laid the cloth with my own hands, I awaited the result with composure. At the appointed time my 3 visitors arrived together. Mr. Micawber with more shirt collar than usual, and a new ribbon to his eye glass, Mrs. Micawber with her cap in a whitey brown paper parcel, Traddles carrying the parcel and supporting Mrs. Micawber on his arm. They were all delighted with my residence. When I conducted Mrs. Micawber to my dressing table, and she saw the scale on which it was prepared for her, she was in such raptures that she called Mr. Micawber to come in and look. "My dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "this is luxurious. This is a way of life which reminds me of the period when I was myself in a state of celibacy, and Mrs. Micawber had not yet been solicited to plight her faith at the hymeneal altar." "He means solicited by him, Mr. Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber archly. "He cannot answer for others." "My dear," returned Mr. Micawber with sudden seriousness, "I have no desire to answer for others. I am too well aware that when, in the inscrutable decrees of fate, you were reserved for me, it is possible you may have been reserved for one destined, after a protracted struggle, at length to fall a victim to pecuniary involvements of a complicated nature. I understand your allusion, my love. I regret it, but I can bear it." "Micawber," exclaimed Mrs. Micawber in tears, Have I deserved this? I, who have never deserted you, who never will desert you, Micawber?" "My love," said Mr. Micawber, much affected, "you will forgive, and our old trusted friend Copperfield will, I am sure, forgive the momentary laceration of a wounded spirit, made sensitive by a recent collision with a minion of power, in other words, with a rebel turncock attached to the waterworks, and will pity, not condemn, its excesses." Mr. Micawber then embraced Mrs. Micawber and pressed my hand, leaving me to infer from this broken allusion that his domestic supply of water had been cut off that afternoon in consequence of default in the payment of the company's rates. To divert his thoughts from this melancholy subject, I informed Mr. Micawber that I relied upon him for a bowl of punch, and led him to the lemons. His recent despondency, not to say despair, was gone in a moment. I never saw a man so thoroughly enjoy himself amid the fragrance of lemon peel and sugar, the odour of burning rum, and the steam of boiling water, as Mr. Micawber did that afternoon. It was wonderful to see his face shining at us out of a thin cloud of these delicate fumes, as he stirred and mixed and tasted, and looked as if he were making, instead of punch, a fortune for his family down to the latest posterity. As to Mrs. Micawber, I don't know whether it was the effect of the cap, or the lavender water, or the pins, or the fire, or the wax candles, but she came out of my room, comparatively speaking, lovely, and the lark was never gayer than that excellent woman. I never ventured to inquire, but I suppose that Mrs. Crupp, after frying the soles, was taken ill, because we broke down at that point. The leg of mutton came up very red within, and very pale without, besides having a foreign substance of a gritty nature sprinkled over it, as if it had had a fall into the ashes of that remarkable kitchen fireplace. But we were not in a condition to judge of this fact from the appearance of the gravy, forasmuch as the young gal had dropped it all upon the stairs, where it remained by the by in a long train until it was worn out. The pigeon pie was not bad, but it was a delusive pie, the crust being like a disappointing head, phrenologically speaking, full of lumps and bumps, with nothing particular underneath. In short, the banquet was such a failure that I should have been quite unhappy, about the failure I mean, for I was always unhappy about Dora, if I had not been relieved by the great good humour of my company, and by a bright suggestion from Mr. Micawber. "My dear friend Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "accidents will occur in the best regulated families, and in families not regulated by that pervading influence which sanctifies while it enhances I would say, in short, the influence of a woman, in the lofty character of a wife, they may be expected with confidence, and must be borne with philosophy. If you will allow me to take the liberty of remarking that there are few comestibles better in their way than a devil, and that I believe, with a little division of labour, we could accomplish a good one if the young person in attendance could produce a gridiron, I would put it to you that this little misfortune may be easily repaired." There was a gridiron in the pantry, on which my morning rasher of bacon was cooked. We had it in a twinkling, and immediately applied ourselves to carrying Mr. Micawber's idea into effect. The division of labour to which he had referred was this. Traddles cut the mutton into slices. Mr. Micawber, who could do anything of this sort to perfection, covered them with pepper, mustard, salt, and cayenne. I put them on the gridiron, turned them with a fork, and took them off under Mr. Micawber's direction, and Mrs. Micawber heated and continually stirred some mushroom ketchup in a little saucepan. When we had slices enough done to begin upon, we fell to, with our sleeves tucked up at the wrists, more slices sputtering and blazing on the fire, and our attention divided between the mutton on our plates and the mutton then preparing. What with the novelty of this cookery, the excellence of it, the bustle of it, the frequent starting up to look after it, the frequent sitting down to dispose of it as the crisp slices came off the gridiron hot and hot, the being so busy, so flushed with the fire, so amused, and in the midst of such a tempting noise and savour, we reduced the leg of mutton to the bone. My own appetite came back miraculously. I am ashamed to record it, but I really believe I forgot Dora for a little while. I am satisfied that Mr. and Mrs. Micawber could not have enjoyed the feast more, if they had sold a bed to provide it. Traddles laughed as heartily almost all the time, as he ate and worked. Indeed we all did, all at once, and I dare say there never was a greater success. We were in the height of our enjoyment, and were all busily engaged in our several departments, endeavouring to bring the last batch of slices to a state of perfection that should crown the feast, when I was aware of a strange presence in the room, and my eyes encountered those of the staid Littimer, standing hat in hand before me. What's the matter? I involuntarily asked. I beg your pardon, sir. I was directed to come in. Is my master not here, sir? No. Have you not seen him, sir? No. Don't you come from him? Not immediately so, sir. Did he tell you would find him here? Not exactly so, sir. But I should think he might be here tomorrow, as he has not been here today. Is he coming up from Oxford? I beg, sir, he returned respectfully, that you will be seated, and allow me to do this. With which he took the fork from my unresisting hand, and bent over the gridiron, as if his whole attention were concentrated on it. We should not have been much discomposed, I dare say, by the appearance of Steerforth himself, but we became in a moment the meekest of the meek before his respectable serving man. Mr. Micawber, humming a tune, to shew that he was quite at ease, subsided into his chair with the handle of a hastily concealed fork sticking out of the bosom of his coat, as if he had stabbed himself. Mrs. Micawber put on her brown gloves, and assumed a genteel languor. Traddles ran his greasy hands through his hair, and stood it bolt upright, and stared in confusion on the tablecloth. As for me, I was a mere infant at the head of my own table, and hardly ventured to glance at the respectable phenomenon, who had come from heaven knows where, to put my establishment to rights. Meanwhile he took the mutton off the gridiron, and gravely handed it round. We all took some, but our appreciation of it was gone, and we merely made a show of eating it. As we severally pushed away our plates, he noiselessly removed them, and set on the cheese. He took that off too when it was done with, cleared the table, piled everything on the dumb waiter, gave us our wine glasses, and of his own accord wheeled the dumb waiter into the pantry. All this was done in a perfect manner, and he never raised his eyes from what he was about. Yet his very elbows, when he had his back towards me, seemed to teem with the expression of his fixed opinion that I was extremely young. Can I do anything more, sir? I thanked him and said no, but would he take no dinner himself? None, I'm obliged to you, sir. Is Mr. Steerforth coming from Oxford? I beg pardon, sir. Is Mr. Steerforth coming from Oxford? I should imagine that he might be here tomorrow, sir. I rather thought he might have been here today, sir. The mistake is mine, no doubt, sir. If you should see him first, said I. If you'll excuse me, sir, I don't think I shall see him first. In case you do, said I, pray say that I am sorry he was not here today, as an old schoolfellow of his was here. Indeed, sir, and he divided a bow between me and Traddles, with a glance at the latter. He was moving softly to the door, when, in a forlorn hope of saying something naturally, which I never could, to this man, I said, "Oh, Littimer." Sir? Did you remain long at Yarmouth that time? Not particularly so, sir. You saw the boat completed? Yes, sir. I remained behind on purpose to see the boat completed. I know. He raised his eyes to mine respectfully. Mr. Steerforth has not seen it yet, I suppose? I really can't say, sir. I think, but I really can't say, sir. I wish you good night, sir. He comprehended everybody present with the respectful bow with which he followed these words, and disappeared. My visitor seemed to breathe far more easily when he was gone, but my own relief was very great, for besides the constraint, arising from that extraordinary sense of being at a disadvantage, which I always had in this man's presence, my conscience had embarrassed me with whispers that I had mistrusted his master, and I could not repress a vague uneasy dread that he might find it out. How was it, having so little in reality to conceal, that I always did feel as if this man were finding me out? Mr. Micawber roused me from this reflection, which was blended with a certain remorseful apprehension of seeing Steerforth himself, by bestowing many encomiums on the absent Littimer as a most respectable fellow, and a thoroughly admirable servant. Mr. Micawber, I may remark, had taken his full share of the general bow, and had received it with infinite condescension. But punch, my dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, tasting it, like time and tide, waits for no man. Ah, it is at the present moment in high flavour. My love, will you give me your opinion? Mrs. Micawber pronounced it excellent. Then I will drink, said Mr. Micawber, if my friend Copperfield will permit me to take that social liberty, to the days when my friend Copperfield and myself were younger, and fought our way in the world side by side. I may say of myself and Copperfield, in the words we have sung together before now, that we twae have run about the braes and pud the goings fine, in a figurative point of view, on several occasions. I am not exactly aware, said Mr. Micawber, with the old roll in his voice, and the old indescribable air of saying something genteel, what gowns may be, but I have no doubt that Copperfield and myself would frequently have taken a pull at them, if it had been feasible. Mr. Micawber, at the then present moment, took a pull at his punch. So we all did, Travels evidently lost in wondering at what distant time Mr. Micawber and I could have been comrades in the battle of the world. Ahem, said Mr. Micawber, clearing his throat, and warming with the punch and the fire. My dear, another glass? Mrs. Micawber said it must be very little, but we couldn't allow that, so it was a glassful. As we are quite confidential here, Mr. Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, sipping her punch, Mr. Traddles being part of our domesticity, I should much like to have your opinion on Mr. Micawber's prospects. For corn, said Mrs. Micawber argumentatively, as I have repeatedly said to Mr. Micawber, may be gentlemanly, but it is not remunerative. Commission to the extent of 2 9 in a fortnight cannot, however limited our ideas, be considered remunerative. We were all agreed upon that. Then, said Mrs. Micawber, who prided herself on taking a clear view of things, and keeping Mr. Micawber straight by her woman's wisdom, when he might otherwise go a little crooked, then I ask myself this question. If corn is not to be relied upon, what is? Are coals to be relied upon? Not at all. We have turned our attention to that experiment, on the suggestion of my family, and we find it fallacious. Mr. Micawber, leaning back in his chair with his hands in his pockets, eyed us aside and nodded his head, as much as to say that the case was very clearly put. The articles of corn and coals, said Mrs. Micawber, still more argumentatively, being equally out of the question, Mr. Copperfield, I naturally look round the world and say, what is there in which a person of Mr. Micawber's talent is likely to succeed? And I exclude the doing anything on commission, because commission is not a certainty. What is best suited to a person of Mr. Micawber's peculiar temperament is, I am convinced, a certainty. Traddles and I both expressed, by a feeling murmur, that this great discovery was no doubt true of Mr. Micawber, and that it did him much credit. I will not conceal from you, my dear Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, that I have long felt the brewing business to be particularly adapted to Mr. Micawber. Look at Barclay and Perkins, look at Truman, Hanbury, and Buxton. It is on that extensive footing that Mr. Micawber, I know from my knowledge of him, is calculated to shine, and the profits, I am told, are enormous. But if Mr. Micawber cannot get into the firms, which decline to answer his letters, when he offers his services even in an inferior capacity, what is the use of dwelling upon that idea? None. I may have a conviction that Mr. Micawber's manners— Really, my dear, interposed Mr. Micawber. My love, be silent, said Mrs. Micawber, laying her brown glove on his hand. I may have a conviction, Mr. Copperfield, that Mr. Micawber's manners peculiarly qualify him for the banking business. I may argue within myself, that if I had a deposit at a banking house, the manners of Mr. Micawber, as representing that banking house, would inspire confidence, and must extend the connection. But if the various banking houses refuse to avail themselves of Mr. Micawber's abilities, or receive the offer of them with contumely, what is the use of dwelling upon that idea? None. As to originating a banking business, I may know that there are members of my family who, if they chose to place their money in Mr. Micawber's hands, might found an establishment of that description. But if they do not choose to place their money in Mr. Micawber's hands, which they don't, what is the use of that? Again I contend that we are no farther advanced than we were before. I shook my head and said, not a bit. Traddles also shook his head and said, not a bit. What do I deduce from this? Mrs. Micawber went on to say, still with the same air of putting a case lucidly. What is the conclusion, my dear Mr. Copperfield, to which I am irresistibly brought? Am I wrong in saying it is clear that we must live? I answered, not at all, and Traddles answered, not at all, and I found myself afterwards sagely adding, alone, that a person must either live or die. Just so, returned Mrs. Micawber, it is precisely that, and the fact is, my dear Mr. Copperfield, that we cannot live without something widely different from existing circumstances shortly turning up. Now I am convinced myself
and this I have pointed out to Mr. Micawber several times of late, that things cannot be expected to turn up of themselves. We must, in measure, assist them to turn up. I may be wrong, but I have formed that opinion.' Both Traddles and I applauded it highly. 'Very well,' said Mrs. Micawber, 'then what do I recommend? Here is Mr. Micawber with a variety of qualifications, with great talent.' 'Really, my love,' said Mr. Micawber. 'Pray, my dear, allow me to continue. Here is Mr. Micawber with a variety of qualifications, with great talent, I should say with genius, but that may be the partiality of a wife.' Traddles and I both murmured, 'No.' 'And here is Mr. Micawber without any suitable position or employment. Where does that responsibility rest? Clearly on society. Then I would make a fact so disgracefully known, and boldly challenge society to set it right. It appears to me, my dear Mr. Copperfield,' said Mrs. Micawber forcibly, 'that what Mr. Micawber has to do is to throw down the gauntlet to society, and say in effect, "Shew me who will take that up. Let the party immediately step forward."' I ventured to ask Mrs. Micawber how this was to be done. 'By advertising,' said Mrs. Micawber, 'in all the papers. It appears to me that what Mr. Micawber has to do, in justice to himself, in justice to his family, and I will even go so far as to say in justice to society, by which he has been hitherto overlooked, is to advertise in all the papers, to describe himself plainly as so and so, with such and such qualifications, and to put it thus: "Now employ me on remunerative terms, and address post paid to W.M. Post Office, Camden Town."' 'This idea of Mrs. Micawber's, my dear Copperfield,' said Mr. Micawber, making his shirt collar meet in front of his chin, and glancing at me sideways, 'is in fact the leap to which I alluded, when I last had the pleasure of seeing you.' 'Advertising is rather expensive,' I remarked dubiously. 'Exactly so,' said Mrs. Micawber, preserving the same logical air. 'Quite true, my dear Copperfield. I have made the identical observation to Mr. Micawber. It is for that reason especially, that I think Mr. Micawber ought, as I have already said, in justice to himself, in justice to his family, and in justice to society, to raise a certain sum of money, on a bill.' Mr. Micawber, leaning back in his chair, trifled with his eye glass, and cast his eyes up at the ceiling, but I thought him observant of Traddles too, who was looking at the fire. 'If no member of my family,' said Mrs. Micawber, 'is possessed of sufficient natural feeling to negotiate that bill, I believe there is a better business term to express what I mean.' Mr. Micawber, with his eyes still cast up at the ceiling, suggested 'discount.' 'To discount that bill,' said Mrs. Micawber, 'then my opinion is, that Mr. Micawber should go into the city, should take that bill into the money market, and should dispose of it for what he can get. If the individuals in the money market oblige Mr. Micawber to sustain a great sacrifice, that is between themselves and their consciences. I view it steadily as an investment. I recommend Mr. Micawber, my dear Mr. Copperfield, to do the same, to regard it as an investment which is sure of return, and to make up his mind to any sacrifice.' I felt, but I am sure I don't know why, that this was self-denying and devoted in Mrs. Micawber, and I uttered a murmur to that effect. Traddles, who took his tone from me, did likewise, still looking at the fire. 'I will not,' said Mrs. Micawber, finishing her punch, and gathering her scarf about her shoulders, preparatory to her withdrawal to my bedroom, 'I will not protract these remarks on the subject of Mr. Micawber's pecuniary affairs. At your fireside, my dear Mr. Copperfield, and in the presence of Mr. Traddles, who, though not so old a friend, is quite one of ourselves, I could not refrain from making you acquainted with the course I advise Mr. Micawber to take. I feel that the time has arrived when Mr. Micawber should exert himself, and I will add, assert himself, and it appears to me that these are the means. I am aware that I am merely a female, and that a masculine judgment is usually considered more competent to the discussion of such questions. Still I must not forget that, when I lived at home with my papa and mamma, my papa was in the habit of saying, "Emma's form is fragile, but her grasp of a subject is inferior to none." That my papa too was partial, I well know, but that he was an observer of character in some degree, my duty and my reason equally forbid me to doubt.' With these words, and resisting our entreaties that she would grace the remaining circulation of the punch with her presence, Mrs. Micawber retired to my bedroom. And really I felt that she was a noble woman, the sort of woman who might have been a Roman matron, and done all manner of heroic things in times of public trouble. In the fervour of this impression I congratulated Mr. Micawber on the treasure he possessed, So did Traddles. Mr. Micawber extended his hand to each of us in succession, and then covered his face with his pocket handkerchief, which I think had more snuff upon it than he was aware. He then returned to the punch in the highest state of exhilaration. He was full of eloquence. He gave us to understand that in our children we lived again, and that, under the pressure of pecuniary difficulties, any accession to their number was doubly welcome. He said that Mrs. Micawber had latterly had her doubts on this point, but that he had dispelled them and reassured her. As to her family, they were totally unworthy of her, their sentiments were utterly indifferent to him, and they might, I quote his own expression, go to the devil. Mr. Micawber then delivered a warm eulogy on Traddles. He said Traddles was a character, to the steady virtues of which he, Mr. Micawber, would lay no claim, but which, he thanked heaven, he could admire. He feelingly alluded to the young lady unknown, whom Traddles had honoured with his affection, and who had reciprocated that affection by honouring and blessing Traddles with her affection. Mr. Micawber pledged her, so did I. Traddles thanked us both by saying, with a simplicity and honesty I had sense enough to be quite charmed with, I am very much obliged to you indeed, and I do assure you she is the dearest girl. Mr. Micawber took an early opportunity after that of hinting with the utmost delicacy and ceremony at the state of my affections. Nothing but the serious assurance of his friend Copperfield to the contrary, he observed, could deprive him of the impression that his friend Copperfield loved and was beloved. After feeling very hot and uncomfortable for some time, and after a good deal of blushing, stammering, and denying, I said, having my glass in my hand, well, I would give them D, which so excited and gratified Mr. Micawber that he ran with a glass of punch into my bedroom, in order that Mrs. Micawber might drink D, who drank it with enthusiasm, crying from within in a shrill voice, Hear, hear, my dear Copperfield, I am delighted, hear, and tapping the wall by way of applause. Our conversation afterwards took a more worldly turn, Mr. Micawber telling us that he found Camden Town inconvenient, and that the first thing he contemplated doing, when the advertisement should have been the cause of something satisfactory turning up, was to move. He mentioned a terrace at the western end of Oxford Street, fronting Hyde Park, on which he always had his eye, but which he did not expect to attain immediately, as it would require a large establishment. There would probably be an interval, he explained, in which he should content himself with the upper part of a house, over some respectable place of business, say in Piccadilly, which would be a cheerful situation for Mrs. Micawber, and where by throwing out a bow window, or carrying up the roof another story, or making some little alteration of that sort, they might live comfortably and reputably for a few years. Whatever was reserved for him, he expressly said, or whatever his abode might be, we might rely on this. There would always be a room for Traddles, and a knife and fork for me. We acknowledged his kindness, and he begged us to forgive his having launched into these practical and business-like details, and to excuse it as natural in one who was making entirely new arrangements in life. Mrs. Micawber, tapping at the wall again to know if tea were ready, broke up this particular phase of our friendly conversation. She made tea for us in a most agreeable manner, and whenever I went near her, in handing out the teacups and bread and butter, she asked me in a whisper whether D was fair or dark, or whether she was short or tall, or something of that kind, which I think I liked. After tea we discussed a variety of topics before the fire, and Mrs. Micawber was good enough to sing us, in a small thin flat voice which I remembered to have considered, when I first knew her, the very table beer of acoustics, the favourable ballads of The Dashing White Sergeant and Little Tafflin. For both of these songs Mrs. Micawber had been famous when she lived at home with her papa and mamma. Mr. Micawber told us that when he heard her sing the first one, on the first occasion of his seeing her beneath the parental roof, she had attracted his attention in an extraordinary degree, but that when it came to Little Tafflin, he had resolved to win that woman or perish in the attempt. It was between 10 and 11 o'clock when Mrs. Micawber rose to replace her cap in the whitey brown paper parcel, and to put on her bonnet. Mr. Micawber took the opportunity of Traddles putting on his greatcoat to slip a letter into my hand, with a whispered request that I would read it at my leisure. I also took the opportunity of holding my candle over the banisters to light them down, when Mr. Micawber was going first, leading Mrs. Micawber, and Traddles was following with the cap, to detain Traddles for a moment on the top of the stairs. Traddles, said I, Mr. Micawber don't mean any harm, poor fellow, but if I were you, I wouldn't lend him anything. My dear Copperfield, returned Traddles, smiling, I haven't got anything to lend. You have got a name, you know, I said. Oh, you call that something to lend, returned Traddles with a thoughtful look. Certainly. Oh, said Traddles, yes, to be sure. I am very much obliged to you, Copperfield, but I am afraid I have lent him that already. For the bill that is to be a certain investment, I inquired. No, said Traddles, not for that one. This is the first I have heard of that one. I have been thinking that he will most likely propose that one on the way home. Mine's another. I hope there will be nothing wrong about it, I said. I hope not, said Traddles. I should think not, though, because he told me only the other day that it was provided for. That was Mr. Micawber's expression, provided for. Mr. Micawber looking up at this juncture to where we were standing, I had only time to repeat my caution. Traddles thanked me and descended, but I was much afraid, when I observed the good-natured manner in which he went down with the cap in his hand, and gave Mrs. Micawber his arm, that he would be carried into the money market neck and heels. I returned to my fireside, and was musing, half gravely and half laughing, on the character of Mr. Micawber and the old relations between us, when I heard a quick step ascending the stairs. At first I thought it was Traddles coming back for something Mr. Micawber had left behind, but as the step approached I knew it, and felt my heart beat high and my blood rush to my face, for it was Steerforth's. I never was unmindful of Agnes, and she never left that sanctuary in my thoughts, if I may call it so, where I had placed her from the first. But when he entered and stood before me with his hand out, the darkness that had fallen on him changed to light, and I felt confounded and ashamed of having doubted one I loved so heartily. I loved her none the less. I thought of her as the same benignant, gentle angel in my life. I reproached myself, not her, with having done him an injury, and I would have made him any atonement if I had known what to make and how to make it. Why, Daisy, old boy, dumbfoundered, laughed Steerforth, shaking my hand heartily, and throwing it gaily away. Have I detected you in another feast, you sybarite? These Dr. Commons fellows are the gayest men in town, I believe. You beat us sober Oxford people all to nothing. His bright glance went merrily round the room, as he took the seat on the sofa opposite me, which Mrs. Micawber had recently vacated, and stirred the fire into a blaze. I was so surprised at first, said I, giving him welcome with all the cordiality I felt, that I had hardly breath to greet you with, Steerforth. Well, the sight of me is good for sore eyes, as the Scotch say, replied Steerforth, and so is the sight of you, Daisy, in full bloom. How are you, my bacchanal? I am very well, said I, not at all a bacchanalian to-night, though I confess to another party of 3. All of whom I met in the street, talking loud in your praise, returned Steerforth. Who's your friend in the tights? I gave him the best idea I could in a few words of Mr. Micawber. He laughed heartily at my feeble portrait of that gentleman, and said he was a man to know, and he must know him. But who do you suppose our other friend is? Said I in my turn. Heaven knows, said Steerforth. Not a bore, I hope. I thought he looked a little like one. Traddles, said I triumphantly. Who's he? Asked Steerforth in his careless way. Don't you remember Traddles? Traddles in our room at Salem House? Oh, that fellow, said Steerforth, beating a lump of coal on the top of the fire with the poker. Is he as soft as ever? And where the deuce did you pick him up? I extolled Traddles in reply, as highly as I could, for I felt that Steerforth rather slighted him. Steerforth dismissed the subject with a light nod and a smile, and the remark that he would be glad to see the old fellow too, for he had always been an odd fish, inquired if I could give him anything to eat. During most of this short dialogue, when he had not been speaking in a wild vivacious manner, he sat idly beating on the lump of coal with the poker. I observed that he did the same thing while I was getting out the remains of the pigeon pie and so forth. Why, Daisy, here's a supper for a king, he exclaimed, starting out of his silence with a burst, and taking his seat at the table. I shall do it justice, for I have come from Yarmouth. I thought you came from Oxford, I returned. Not I, said Steerforth. I have been seafaring, better employed. Littimer was here to-day to inquire for you, I remarked, and I understood him that you were at Oxford, though now I think of it, he certainly did not say so. Littimer is a greater fool than I thought him, to have been inquiring for me at all, said Steerforth, jovially pouring out a glass of wine and drinking to me. As to understanding him, you're a cleverer fellow than most of us, Daisy, if you can do that. That's true, indeed, said I, moving my chair to the table. So you have been at Yarmouth, Steerforth, interested to know all about it. Have you been there long? No, he returned, an escapade of a week or so. And how are they all? Of course little Emily is not married yet. Not yet. Going to be, I believe, in so many weeks or months or something or other. I have not seen much of him. By the by, he laid down his knife and fork, which he had been using with great diligence, and began feeling in his pockets. I have a letter for you. From whom? Why, from your old nurse, he returned, taking some papers out of his breast pocket. J. Steerforth, Esquire, debtor to the willing mind. That's not it. Patience, and we'll find it presently. Old what's-his-name is in a bad way, and it's about that, I believe. Barkis, do you mean? Yes, still feeling in his pockets and looking over their contents. It's all over for poor Barkis, I'm afraid. I saw a little apothecary there, surgeon or whatever he is, who brought your worship into the world. He was mighty learned about the case to me, but the upshot of his opinion was, that the carrier was making his last journey rather fast. Put your hand into the breast pocket of my great coat on the chair yonder, and I think you'll find the letter. Is it there? Here it is, said I. That's right. It was from Peggotty. Something less legible than usual in brief. It informed me of her husband's hopeless state, and hinted at his being a little nearer than heretofore, and consequently more difficult to manage for his own comfort. It said nothing of her weariness and watching, and praised him highly. It was written with a plain, unaffected, homely piety that I knew to be genuine, and ended with, my duty to my ever darling, meaning myself. While I deciphered it, Steerforth continued to eat and drink. It's a bad job, he said when I had done, but the sun sets every day, and people die every minute, and we mustn't be scared by the common lot. If we failed to hold our own because that equal foot at all man's doors was heard knocking somewhere, every object in this world would slip from us. No, ride on, rough shod if need be, smooth shod if that will do, but ride on over all obstacles and win the race. And win what race? Said I. The race that one has started in, he said. Ride on. I noticed, I remember, as he paused, looking at me with his handsome head a little thrown back and his glass raised in his hand, that though the freshness of the sea wind was on his face, there were traces in it made since I last saw him, as if he had applied himself to some habitual strain of the fervent energy which, when roused, was so passionately roused within him. I had it in my thoughts to remonstrate with him upon his desperate way of pursuing any fancy that he took, such as this buffeting of rough seas, and braving of hard weather, for example, when my mind glanced off to the immediate subject of our conversation again, and pursued that instead. I'll tell you what, Steerforth, said I, if your high spirits will listen to me. They are potent spirits, and will do whatever you like, he answered, moving from the table to the fireside again. Then I'll tell you what, Steerforth, I think I will go down and see my old nurse. It is not that I can do her any good, or render her any real service, but she is so attached to me, that my visit will have as much effect on her as if I could do both. She will take it so kindly, that it will be a comfort and support to her. It's no great effort to make, I'm sure, for such a friend as she has been to me. Wouldn't you go a day's journey, if you were in my place? His face was thoughtful, as he sat considering a little before he answered in a low voice. Well, go. You can do no harm. You have just come back, said I, and it would be in vain to ask you to go with me. Quite, returned he. I am for Highgate to-night. I have not seen my mother this long time, and it lies upon my conscience, for it's something to be loved as she loves her prodigal son. Ah, nonsense, you mean to go to-morrow, I suppose, he said, holding me out at arm's length, with a hand on each of my shoulders. Yes, I think so. Well then, don't go till next day. I wanted you to come and stay a few days with us. Here I am on purpose to bid you, and you fly off to Yarmouth. You're a nice fellow to talk of flying off, Steerforth, who are always running wild on some unknown expedition or other. He looked at me for a moment without speaking, and then rejoined, still holding me as before, and giving me a shake. Come, say the next day, and pass as much of tomorrow as you can with us. Who knows when we may meet again else? Come, say the next day. I want you to stand between Rosa Dartle and me, and keep us asunder. Would you love each other too much without me? Yes, or hate, laughed Steerforth, no matter which. Come, say the next day. I said the next day, and he put on his great coat and lighted his cigar, and set off to walk home. Finding him in this intention, I put on my own great coat, but I did not light my own cigar, having had enough of that for a while, and walked with him as far as the open road, a dull road then at night. He was in great spirits all the way, and when we parted, and I looked after him going so gallantly and airily homeward, I thought of his saying, "Ride on over all obstacles, and win the race," and wished for the first time that he had some worthy race to run. I was undressing in my own room, when Mr. Micawber's letter tumbled on the floor. Thus reminded of it, I broke the seal and read as follows. It was dated an hour and a half before dinner. I am not sure whether I have mentioned that, when Mr. Micawber was at any particularly desperate crisis, he used a sort of legal phraseology, which he seemed to think equivalent to winding up his affairs. Sir, for I dare not call you my dear Copperfield, it is expedient that I should inform you that the undersigned is crushed. Some flickering efforts to spare you the premature knowledge of this calamitous position you may observe in him this day, but hope has sunk beneath the horizon, and the undersigned is crushed. The present communication is penned within the personal range, I cannot call it the society, of an individual in a state closely bordering on intoxication, employed by a broker. That individual is in legal possession of the premises, under a distress for rent. His inventory includes not only the chattels and effects of every description belonging to the undersigned, as yearly tenant of this habitation, but also those appertaining to Mr. Thomas Traddles, lodger, a member of the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple. If any drop of gloom were wanting in the overflowing cup which is now commended, in the language of an immortal writer, to the lips of the undersigned, it would be found in the fact that a friendly acceptance granted to the undersigned by the aforementioned Mr. Thomas Traddles, for the sum of £23 4 shillings 9 1/2 pence, is overdue and is not provided for. Also in the fact that the living responsibilities clinging to the undersigned will, in the course of nature, be increased by the sum of one more helpless victim, whose miserable appearance may be looked for in round numbers at the expiration of a period not exceeding 6 lunar months from the present date. After premising thus much, it would be a work of supererogation to add that dust and ashes are for ever scattered on the head of Wilkins Micawber. Poor Traddles! I knew enough of Mr. Micawber by this time to foresee that he might be expected to recover the blow, but my night's rest was sorely distressed by the thought of Traddles, and of the curate's daughter, who was one of 10, down in Devonshire, and who was such a dear girl, and who would wait for Traddles, ominous praise, until she was 60, or any age that could be mentioned. End of chapter 28. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 29. I visit Steerforth at his home again. I mentioned to Mr. Spenlow in the morning that I wanted leave of absence for a short time, and as I was not in the receipt of any salary, and consequently was not obnoxious to the implacable Jorkins, there was no difficulty about it. I took that opportunity, with my voice sticking in my throat, and my sight failing as I uttered the words, to express my hope that Miss Spenlow was quite well, to which Mr. Spenlow replied, with no more emotion than if he had been speaking of an ordinary human being, that he was much obliged to me, and she was very well. We articled clerks, as germs of the patrician order of proctors, were treated with so much consideration that I was almost my own master at all times. As I did not care, however, to get to Highgate before 1 or 2 o'clock in the day, and as we had another little excommunication case in court that morning, which was called the office of the judge promoted by Tipkins against Bullock for his soul's correction, I passed an hour or two in attendance on it with Mr. Spenlow very agreeably. It arose out of a scuffle between two churchwardens, one of whom was alleged to have pushed the other against a pump, the handle of which pump projecting into a schoolhouse, which schoolhouse was under the gable of a church roof, made the push an ecclesiastical offence. It was an amusing case, and sent me up to Highgate on the box of the stage-coach, thinking about the Commons, and what Mr. Spenlow had said about touching the Commons and bringing down the country. Mrs. Steerforth was pleased to see me, and so was Rosa Dartle. I was agreeably surprised to find that Littimer was not there, and that we were attended by a modest little parlour maid, with blue ribbons in her cap, whose eye it was much more pleasant and much less disconcerting to catch by accident than the eye of that respectable man. But what I particularly observed, before I had been half an hour in the house, was the close and attentive watch Miss Dartle kept upon me, and the lurking manner in which she seemed to compare my face with Steerforth's, and Steerforth's with mine, and to lie in wait for something to come out between the two. So surely as I looked towards her, did I see that eager visage with its gaunt black eyes and searching brow intent on mine, or passing suddenly from mine to Steerforth's, or comprehending both of us at once. In this lynx-like scrutiny she was so far from faltering when she saw I observed it, that at such a time she only fixed her piercing look upon me with a more intent expression still. Blameless as I was, and I knew that I was, in reference to any wrong she could possibly suspect me of, I shrunk before her strange eyes, quite unable to endure their hungry lustre. All day she seemed to pervade the whole house. If I talked to Steerforth in his room, I heard her dress rustle in the little gallery outside, when he and I engaged in some of our old exercises on the lawn behind the house. I saw her face pass from window to window, like a wandering light, until it fixed itself in one, and watched us. When we all four went out walking in the afternoon, she closed her thin hand on my arm like a spring, to keep me back, while Steerforth and his mother went on out of hearing, and then she spoke to me. "You have been a long time," she said, "without coming here. Is your profession really so engaging and interesting as to absorb your whole attention? I ask because I always want to be informed when I am ignorant. Is it really, though?" I replied that I liked it well enough, but that I certainly could not claim so much for it. "Oh, I am glad to know that, because I always like to be put right when I am wrong," said Rosa Dartle. "You mean it is a little dry, perhaps?" "Well," I replied, "perhaps it was a little dry." "Oh, and that's a reason why you want relief and change, excitement and all that," said she. "Ah, very true. But isn't it a little, for him? I don't mean you." A quick glance of her eye towards the spot where Steerforth was walking, with his mother leaning on his arm, shewed me whom she meant, but beyond that I was quite lost, and I looked so, I have no doubt. "Don't it? I don't say that it does. Mind, I want to know, don't it rather engross him? Don't it make him perhaps a little more remiss than usual in his visits to his blindly doting, with another quick glance at them, and such a glance at me as seemed to look into my innermost thoughts. "Miss Dartle," I returned, "pray do not think—" "I don't," said she. "Oh dear me, don't suppose that I think anything. I am not suspicious. I only ask a question. I don't state my opinion. I want to found an opinion on what you tell me. Then it is not so. Well, I am very glad to know it." "It certainly is not the fact," said I, perplexed, "that I am accountable for Steerforth's having been away from home longer than usual, if he has been, which I really don't know at this moment, unless I understand it from you. I have not seen him this long while, until last night." "No? Indeed, Miss Dartle, no." As she looked full at me, I saw her face grow sharper and paler, and the marks of the old wound lengthen out until it cut through the disfigured lip, and deep into the nether lip, and slanted down the face. There was something positively awful to me in this, and in the brightness of her eyes, as she said, looking fixedly at me, "What is he doing?" I repeated the words, more to myself than her, being so amazed. "What is he doing?" she said, with an eagerness that seemed enough to consume her like a fire. "In what is that man assisting him, who never looks at me without an inscrutable falsehood in his eyes? If you are honourable and faithful, I don't ask you to betray your friend. I ask you only to tell me, is it anger, is it hatred, is it pride, is it restlessness, is it some wild fancy, is it love? What is it that is leading him?" "Miss Dartle," I returned, "how shall I tell you, so that you will believe me, that I know nothing at Steerforth different from what there was when I first came here? I can think of nothing. I firmly believe there is nothing. I hardly understand even what you mean." As she still stood looking fixedly at me, a twitching or throbbing, from which I could not dissociate the idea of pain, came into that cruel mark, and lifted up the corner of her lip, as if with scorn, or with a pity that despised its object. She put her hand upon it hurriedly, a hand so thin and delicate, that when I had seen her hold it up before the fire to shade her face, I had compared it in my thoughts to fine porcelain, and saying, in a quick, fierce, passionate way, "I swear you to secrecy about this," said not a word more. Mrs. Steerforth was particularly happy in her son's society, and Steerforth was, on this occasion, particularly attentive and respectful to her. It was very interesting to me to see them together, not only on account of their mutual affection, but because of the strong personal resemblance between them, and the manner in which what was haughty or impetuous in him was softened by age and sex in her, to a gracious dignity. I thought more than once that it was well no serious cause of division had ever come between them, or two such natures, I ought rather to express it, two such shades of the same nature, might have been harder to reconcile than the two extremest opposites in creation. The idea did not originate in my own discernment, I am bound to confess, but in a speech of Rosa Dartle's. She said at dinner, 'Oh, but do tell me though, somebody, because I have been thinking about it all day, and I want to know.' 'You want to know what, Rosa?' returned Mrs. Steerforth. Pray, Rosa, do not be mysterious.' 'Mysterious!' she cried. 'Oh, really, do you consider me so?' 'Do I constantly entreat you,' said Mrs. Steerforth, 'to speak plainly, in your own natural manner?' 'Oh, then this is not my natural manner,' she rejoined. 'Now you must really bear with me, because I ask for information. We never know ourselves.' 'It has become a second nature,' said Mrs. Steerforth, without any displeasure. 'But I remember, and so must you, I think, when your manner was different, Rosa, when it was not so guarded, and was more trustful.' 'I am sure you are right,' she returned, 'and so it is that bad habits grow upon one. Really, less guarded and more trustful! How can I, imperceptibly, have changed, I wonder? Well, that's very odd. I must study to regain my former self.' 'I wish you would,' said Mrs. Steerforth with a smile. 'Oh, I really will, you know,' she answered. 'I will learn frankness from James.' 'You cannot learn frankness, Rosa,' said Mrs. Steerforth quickly, for there was always some effect of sarcasm in what Rosa Dartle said, though it was said, as this was, in the most unconscious manner in the world, 'in a better school.' 'That I am sure of,' she answered, with uncommon fervour. 'If I am sure of anything, of course, you know, I am sure of that.' Mrs. Steerforth appeared to me to regret having been a little nettled, for she presently said, in a kind tone, 'Well, my dear Rosa, we have not heard what it is that you want to be satisfied about.' 'That I want to be satisfied about,' she replied with provoking coldness. 'Oh, it was only whether people, who are like each other in their moral constitutions, is that the phrase?' 'It's as good a phrase as another,' said Steerforth. 'Thank you. Whether people, who are like each other in their moral constitution, are in greater danger than people not so circumstanced, supposing any serious cause of variance to arise between them, of being divided angrily and deeply.' 'I should say yes,' said Steerforth. 'Should you?' she retorted. 'Dear me! Supposing then, for instance, any unlikely thing will do for a supposition, that you and your mother were to have a serious quarrel.' 'My dear Rosa,' interposed Mrs. Steerforth, laughing good naturedly, 'suggest some other supposition. James and I know our duty to each other better, I pray heaven.' 'Oh,' said Miss Dartle, nodding her head thoughtfully, 'to be sure, that would prevent it. Why, of course it would. Exactly. Now I am glad I have been so foolish as to put the case, for it is so very good to know that your duty to each other would prevent it. Thank you very much.' One other little circumstance connected with Miss Dartle I must not omit, for I had reason to remember it thereafter, when all the irremediable past was rendered plain. During the whole of this day, but especially from this period of it, Steerforth exerted himself with his utmost skill, and that was with his utmost ease, to charm this singular creature into a pleasant and pleased companion. That he should succeed was no matter of surprise to me. That she should struggle against the fascinating influence of his delightful art, delightful nature I thought it then, did not surprise me either, for I knew that she was sometimes jaundiced and perverse. I saw her features and her manner slowly change. I saw her look at him with growing admiration. I saw her try, more and more faintly, but always angrily, as if she condemned a weakness in herself, to resist the captivating power that he possessed, and finally I saw her sharp glance soften, and her smile become quite gentle, and I ceased to be afraid of her as I had really been all day, and we all sat down about the fire, talking and laughing together, with as little reserve as if we had been children. Whether it was because we had sat there so long, or because Steerforth was resolved not to lose the advantage he had gained, I do not know, but we did not remain in the dining room more than 5 minutes after her departure. 'She is playing her harp,' said Steerforth softly at the drawing room door, and nobody but my mother has heard her do that, I believe, these 3 years.' He said it with a curious smile, which was gone directly, and we went into the room and found her alone. 'Don't get up,' said Steerforth, which she had already done. 'My dear Rosa, don't. Be kind for once, and sing us an Irish song.' 'What do you care for an Irish song?' she returned. 'Much,' said Steerforth, 'much more than for any other. Here is Daisy too, loves music from his soul. Sing us an Irish song, Rosa, and let me sit and listen, as I used to do.' He did not touch her or the chair from which he had risen, but sat himself near the harp. She stood beside it for some little while, in a curious way, going through the motion of playing it with her right hand, but not sounding it. At length she sat down, and drew it to her with one sudden action, and played and sang. I don't know what it was, in her touch or voice, that made that song the most unearthly I have ever heard in my life, or can imagine. There was something fearful in the reality of it. It was as if it had never been written, or set to music, but sprung out of passion within her, which found imperfect utterance in the low sounds of her voice, and crouched again when all was still. I was dumb when she leaned beside the harp again, playing it but not sounding it with her right hand. A minute more, and this had roused me from my trance. Steerforth had left his seat and gone to her, and had put his arm laughingly about her, and had said, 'Come, Rosa, for the future we will love each other very much.' And she had struck him, and had thrown him off with the fury of a wild cat, and had burst out of the room. 'What's the matter with Rosa?' said Mrs. Steerforth, coming in. 'She has been an angel, mother,' returned Steerforth, 'for a little while, and has run into the opposite extreme since, by way of compensation.' 'You should be careful not to irritate her, James. Her temper has been soured, remember, and ought not to be tried.' Rosa did not come back, and no other mention was made of her, until I went with Steerforth into his room to say good night. Then he laughed about her, and asked me if I had ever seen such a fierce little piece of incomprehensibility. I expressed as much of my astonishment as was then capable of expression, and asked if he could guess what it was that she had taken so much amiss, so suddenly. 'Oh, heaven knows,' said Steerforth, 'anything you like, or nothing. I told you she took everything, including herself, to a grindstone, and sharpened it. She is an edge tool, and requires great care in dealing with. She is always dangerous. Good night.' 'Good night,' said I, 'my dear Steerforth. I shall be gone before you wake in the morning. Good night.' He was unwilling to let me go, and stood holding me out with a hand on each of my shoulders, as he had done in my own room. 'Daisy,' he said with a smile, 'for though that's not the name your godfathers and godmothers gave you, it's the name I like best to call you by, and I wish you could give it to me.' 'Why, so I can, if I choose,' said I. 'Daisy, if anything should ever separate us, you must think of me at my best, old boy. Come, let us make that bargain. Think of me at my best, if circumstances should ever part us.' 'You have no best to me, Steerforth,' said I, 'and no worst. You were always equally loved and cherished in my heart.' So much compunction for having ever wronged him, even by a shapeless thought, did I feel within me, that the confession of having done so was rising to my lips. But for the reluctance I had to betray the confidence of Agnes, but for my uncertainty how to approach the subject with no risk of doing so, it would have reached him before he said, 'God bless you, Daisy, and good night.' In my doubt it did not reach them, and we shook hands and we parted. I was up with the dull dawn, and having dressed as quietly as I could, looked into his room. He was fast asleep, lying easily with his head upon his arm, as I had often seen him lie at school. The time came in its season, and that was very soon, when I almost wondered that nothing troubled his repose as I looked at him. But he slept, let me think of him so again, as I had often seen him sleep at school, and thus in this silent hour I left him. Never more, oh God forgive you, Steerforth, to touch that passive hand in love and friendship. Never, never more. End of chapter 29.
Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 30. A Loss.
I got down to Yarmouth in the evening, and went to the inn. I knew that Peggotty's spare room, my room, was likely to have occupation enough in a little while, if that great visitor before whose presence all the living must give place were not already in the house, so I betook myself to the inn, and dined there, and engaged my bed. It was 10 o'clock when I went out. Many of the shops were shut, and the town was dull. When I came to Omer and Yoram's, I found the shutters up, but the shop door standing open. As I could obtain a perspective view of Mr. Omer inside, smoking his pipe by the parlour door, I entered and asked him how he was. "Why, bless my life and soul," said Mr. Omer, "how do you find yourself? Take a seat. Smoke not disagreeable, I hope." "By no means," said I like it in somebody else's pipe." "What, not in your own, eh?" Mr. Omer returned, laughing. "All the better, sir. Bad habit for a young man. Take a seat. I smoke myself for the asthma." Mr. Omer had made room for me and placed a chair. He now sat down again, very much out of breath, gasping at his pipe as if it contained a supply of that necessary without which he must perish. "I am sorry to have heard bad news of Mr. Barkis," said I. Mr. Omer looked at me with a steady countenance and shook his head. "Do you know how he is tonight?" I asked. "The very question I should have put to you, sir," returned Mr. Omer, "but on account of delicacy. It's one of the drawbacks in our line of business. When a party's ill, we can't ask how the party is." The difficulty had not occurred to me, though I had had my apprehensions too, when I went in, of hearing the old tune. On its being mentioned, I recognized it, however, and said as much. Yes, you understand," said Mr. Omer, nodding his head. "We durstn't do it. Bless you, it would be a shock that the generality of parties mightn't recover. To say, Omer and Yoram's compliments, and how do you find yourself this morning, or this afternoon, as it may be?" Mr. Omer and I nodded at each other, and Mr. Omer recruited his wind by the aid of his pipe. "It's one of the things that cut the trade off from attentions they could often wish to show," said Mr. Omer. "Take myself. If I have known Barkis a year to move to as he went by, I have known him 40 years. But I can't go and say, how is he?" I felt it was rather hard on Mr. Omer, and I told him so. "I'm not more self-interested, I hope, than another man," said Mr. Omer. "Look at me. My wind may fail at any moment, and it ain't likely that to my own knowledge I'll be self-interested under such circumstances. I say it ain't likely in a man who knows his wind will go, when it does go, as if a pair of bellows was cut open, and that man a grandfather," said Mr. Omer. I said, "Not at all." "It ain't that I complain of my line of business," said Mr. Omer. "It ain't that. Some good and some bad goes, no doubt, to all callings. What I wish is, that parties was brought up stronger minded." Mr. Omer, with a very complacent and amiable face, took several puffs in silence, and then said, resuming his first point, "Accordingly we're obliged, in ascertaining how Barkis goes on, to limit ourselves to Emily. She knows what our real objects are, and she don't have any more alarms or suspicions about us than if we was so many lambs. Minnie and Yoram have just stepped down to the house. In fact, she's there after hours helping her aunt a bit, to ask her how he is tonight. And if you was pleased to wait till they come back, they'd give you full particulars. Will you take something? A glass of shrub and water now? I smoke on shrub and water myself," said Mr. Omer, taking up his glass, "because it's considered softening to the passages, by which this troublesome breath of mine gets into action. But Lord bless you," said Mr. Omer huskily, "it ain't the passages that's out of order. Give me breath enough, said I to my daughter Minnie, and I'll find passages, my dear." He really had no breath to spare, and it was very alarming to see him laugh. When he was again in a condition to be talked to, I thanked him for the proffered refreshment, which I declined, as I had just had dinner, and observing that I would wait, since he was so good as to invite me, until his daughter and his son-in-law came back, I inquired how little Emily was. "Well, sir," said Mr. Omer, removing his pipe, that he might rub his chin, "I'll tell you truly, I shall be glad when her marriage has taken place." "Why so?" I inquired. "Well, she's unsettled at present," said Mr. Omer. "It ain't that she's not as pretty as ever, for she's prettier, I do assure you she is prettier. It ain't that she don't work as well as ever, for she does. She was worth any 6, and she is worth any 6, but somehow she wants heart. If you understand, said Mr. Omer, after rubbing his chin again, and smoking a little, what I mean in a general way by the expression. A long pull and a strong pull, and a pull altogether, my hearties, hurrah! I should say to you that was, in a general way, what I miss in Emily. Mr. Omer's face and manner went for so much that I could conscientiously nod my head as divining his meaning. My quickness of apprehension seemed to please him, and he went on. Now, I consider this principally on account of her being in an unsettled state, you see. We have talked it over a good deal, her uncle and myself, and her sweetheart and myself, after business, and I consider it is principally on account of her being unsettled. You must always recollect of Emily, said Mr. Omer, shaking his head gently, that she's a most extraordinary affectionate little thing. The proverb says, you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Well, I don't know about that. I rather think you may if you begin early in life. She has made a home out of that boat, sir, that stone and marble couldn't beat. I am sure she has, said I. To see the clinging of that pretty little thing to her uncle, said Mr. Omer, to see the way she holds on to him, tighter and tighter and closer every day, is to see a sight. Now you know there's a struggle going on when that's the case. Why should it be made a longer one than is needful? I listened attentively to the good old fellow, and acquiesced with all my heart in what he said. Therefore I mentioned to them, said Mr. Omer, in a comfortable, easy-going tone, this. I said, now don't consider Emily nailed down in point of time at all. Make it your own time. Her services have been more valuable than was supposed. Her learning has been quicker than was supposed. Omer and Yoram can run their pen through what remains, and she's free when you wish. If she likes to make any little arrangement afterwards, in the way of doing any little thing for us at home, very well. If she don't, very well still. We're no losers anyhow. For don't you see, said Mr. Omer, touching me with his pipe, it ain't likely that a man so short of breath as myself, and a grandfather too, would go and strain points with a little bit of a blue-eyed blossom like her. Not at all, I am certain, said I. Not at all, you are right, said Mr. Omer. Well, sir, her cousin, you know it's a cousin she's going to be married to. Oh yes, I replied, I know him well. Of course you do, said Mr. Omer. Well, sir, her cousin being, as it appears, in good work, and well-to-do, thanked me in a very manly sort of manner for this, conducting himself altogether, I must say, in a way that gives me a high opinion of him, and went and took as comfortable a little house as you or I could wish to clap eyes on. That little house is now furnished, right through, as neat and complete as a doll's parlour, and but for Barkis's illness having taken this bad turn, poor fellow, they would have been man and wife, I dare say, by this time. As it is, there's a postponement. And Emily, Mr. Omer, I inquired, has she become more settled? Why, that, you know, he returned, rubbing his double chin again, can't naturally be expected. The prospect of the change and separation and all that is, as one may say, close to her and far away from her, both at once. Barkis's death needn't put it off much, but his lingering might. Anyway, it's an uncertain state of matters, you see. I see, said I. Consequently, pursued Mr. Omer, Emily's still a little down, and a little fluttered. Perhaps on the whole she's more so than she was. Every day she seems to get fonder and fonder of her uncle, and more loath to part from all of us. A kind word from me brings the tears into her eyes, and if you was to see her with my daughter Minnie's little girl, you'd never forget it. Bless my heart alive, said Mr. Omer, pondering, how she loves that child. Having so favourable an opportunity, it occurred to me to ask Mr. Omer, before our conversation should be interrupted by the return of his daughter and her husband, whether he knew anything of Martha. Ah, he rejoined, shaking his head and looking very much dejected. No good. A sad story, sir. However you come to know it. I never thought there was harm in the girl. I wouldn't wish to mention it before my daughter Minnie, for she'd take me up directly, but I never did. None of us ever did. Mr. Omer, on hearing his daughter's footstep before I heard it, touched me with his pipe and shut up one eye as a caution. She and her husband came in immediately afterwards. The report was that Mr. Barkis was as bad could be, and that he was quite unconscious, and that Mr. Chillip had mournfully said in the kitchen on going away just now, that the College of Physicians and the College of Surgeons and Apothecaries' Hall, if they were all called in together, couldn't help him. He was past both colleges, Mr. Chillip said, and the Hall could only poison him. Hearing this, and learning that Mr. Peggotty was there, I determined to go to the house at once. I bade good night to Mr. Omer and to Mr. and Mrs. Yoram, and directed my steps thither with a solemn feeling which made Mr. Barkis quite a new and different creature. My low tap at the door was answered by Mr. Peggotty. He was not so much surprised to see me as I had expected. I remarked this in Peggotty too when she came down, and I have seen it since, and I think in the expectation of that dread surprise all other changes and surprises dwindle to nothing. I shook hands with Mr. Peggotty and passed into the kitchen, while he softly closed the door. Little Emily was sitting by the fire with her hands before her face. Ham was standing near her. We spoke in whispers, listening between whiles for any sound in the room above. I had not thought of it on the occasion of my last visit, but how strange it was to me now to miss Mr. Barkis out of the kitchen. "This is very kind of you, Master Davy," said Mr. Peggotty. "It's uncommon kind," said Ham. "Emily, my dear," cried Mr. Peggotty, "see here, here's Master Davy come. What, cheer up, pretty, not a word to Master Davy?" There was a trembling upon her that I can see now. The coldness of her hand when I touched it I can feel yet. Its only sign of animation was to shrink from mine. And then she glided from the chair, and creeping to the other side of her uncle, bowed herself silently and trembling still upon his breast. "It's such a loving heart," said Mr. Peggotty, smoothing her rich hair with his great hard hand, "that it can't bear the sorrow of this. It's natural in young folk, Master Davy, when they're new to these here trials, and timid like my little bird, it's natural." She clung the closer to him, but neither lifted up her face nor spoke a word. "It's getting very late, my dear," said Mr. Peggotty, "and here's Ham come for to take you home. There, go along with t'other loving heart." "What, Emily? Eh, my pretty?" The sound of her voice had not reached me, but he bent his head as if he listened to her, and then said, "Let you stay with your uncle? Why, you don't mean to ask me that? Stay with your uncle, Moppet, when your husband that'll be so soon is here for to take you home? Now a person wouldn't think of it, for to see this little thing alongside a rough weather chap like me," said Mr. Peggotty, looking round at both of us with infinite pride. "But the sea ain't more salt in it than she has fondness in her for her uncle. A foolish little Emily." "Emily's in the right in that, Master Davy," said Ham. "Look ye here. As Emily wishes of it, and as she's hurried and frightened like besides, I'll leave her till morning. Let me stay too." "No, no," said Mr. Peggotty, "you don't ought to, a married man like you, or what's as good as, to take and hull away a day's work, and you don't ought to watch and work both. That won't do. You go home and turn in. You ain't afeard of Emily not being took good care on, I know." Ham yielded to this persuasion, and took his hat to go. Even when he kissed her, and I never saw him approach her, but I felt that nature had given him the soul of a gentleman, she seemed to cling closer to her uncle, even to the avoidance of her chosen husband. I shut the door after him, so that it might cause no disturbance of the quiet that prevailed, and when I turned back I found Mr. Peggotty still talking to her. "Now I'm going upstairs to tell your aunt as Master Davy's here, and that'll cheer her up a bit," he said. "Sit ye down by the fire the while, my dear, and warm those mortal cold hands. You don't need to be so fearsome, and take on so much. What, you go along with me? Well, come along with me, come. If her uncle was turned out of house and home and forced to lay down in a dyke, Master Davy," said Mr. Peggotty with no less pride than before, "it's my belief she'd go along with him, now. But there'll be someone else soon, Emily." Afterwards, when I went upstairs, as I passed the door of my little chamber, which was dark, I had the indistinct impression of her being within it, cast down upon the floor. But whether it was really she, or whether it was a confusion of the shadows in the room, I don't know now. I had leisure to think before the kitchen fire of pretty little Emily's dread of death, which, added to what Mr. Omer had told me, I took to be the cause of her being so unlike herself, and I had leisure before Peggotty came down even to think more leniently of the weakness of it, as I sat counting the ticking of the clock and deepening my sense of the solemn hush around me. Peggotty took me in her arms, and blessed and thanked me over and over again for being such a comfort to her. That was what she said, in her distress. She then entreated me to come upstairs, sobbing that Mr. Barkis had always liked me and admired me, that he had often talked of me before he fell into a stupor, and that she believed, in case of his coming to himself again, he would brighten up at the sight of me, if he could brighten up at any earthly thing. The probability of his ever doing so appeared to me, when I saw him, to be very small. He was lying with his head and shoulders out of bed, in an uncomfortable attitude, half resting on the box which had cost him so much pain and trouble. I learned that when he was past creeping out of bed to open it, and past assuring himself of its safety by means of the divining rod I had seen him use, he had required to have it placed on the chair at the bedside, where he had ever since embraced it night and day. His arm lay on it now. Time and the world were slipping from beneath him, but the box was there, and the last words he had uttered were, in an explanatory tone, "Old clothes." "Barkis, my dear," said Peggotty almost cheerfully, bending over him, while her brother and I stood at the bed's foot. "Here's my dear boy, Master Davy, who brought us together, Barkis, that you sent messages by, you know. Won't you speak to Master Davy?" He was as mute and senseless as the box, from which his form derived the only expression it had. "He's going out with the tide," said Mr. Peggotty to me behind his hand. My eyes were dim, and so were Mr. Peggotty's, but I repeated in a whisper, "With the tide?" "People can't die along the coast," said Mr. Peggotty, "except when the tide's pretty nigh out. They can't be born unless it's pretty nigh in, not properly born till flood. He's a-going out with the tide. It's ebb at half after 3, slack water half an hour. If he lives till it turns, he'll hold his own till past the flood, and go out with the next tide." We remained there watching him a long time, hours. What mysterious influence my presence had upon him in that state of his senses, I shall not pretend to say, but when at last he began to wander feebly, it is certain he was muttering about driving me to school. "He's coming to himself," said Peggotty. Mr. Peggotty touched me, and whispered with much awe and reverence, "They're both a-going out fast." "Barkis, my dear," said Peggotty. "C.P. Barkis," he said faintly. "No better woman anywhere." "Look, here's Master Davy," said Peggotty, for he now opened his eyes. I was on the point of asking him if he knew me, when he tried to stretch out his arm, and said to me distinctly, with a pleasant smile, "Barkis is willing." And it being low water, he went out with the tide. End of chapter 30. Of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 31. A greater loss. It was not difficult for me, on Peggotty's solicitation, to resolve to stay where I was, until after the remains of the poor carrier should have made their last journey to Blunderstone. She had long ago bought, out of her own savings, a little piece of ground in her old churchyard near the grave of her sweet little girl, as she always called my mother, and there they were laid to rest. In keeping Peggotty company, and doing all I could for her, little enough at the utmost, I was as grateful, I rejoice to think, as even now I could wish myself to have been. But I am afraid I had a supreme satisfaction, of a personal and professional nature, in taking charge of Mr. Barkis's will, and expounding its contents. I may claim the merit of having originated the suggestion that the will should be looked for in the box. After some search, it was found in the box, at the bottom of a horse's nose bag, wherein, besides hay, there was discovered an old gold watch, with chain and seals, which Mr. Barkis had worn on his wedding day, which had never been seen before or since, a silver tobacco stopper in the form of a leg, an imitation lemon full of minute cups and saucers, which I have some idea Mr. Barkis must have purchased to present to me when I was a child, and afterwards found himself unable to part with, 87 guineas and a half, in guineas and half guineas, £210 in perfectly clean bank notes, certain receipts for Bank of England stock, an old horseshoe, a bad shilling, a piece of camphor, and an oyster shell. From the circumstance of the latter article having been much polished, and displaying prismatic colours on the inside, I conclude that Mr Barkis had some general ideas about pearls, which never resolved themselves into anything definite. For years and years Mr Barkis had carried this box on all his journeys every day. That it might the better escape notice, he had invented a fiction that it belonged to Mr Blackboy, and was to be left with Barkis till called for, a fable which he had elaborately written on the lid in characters now scarcely legible. He had hoarded all these years, I found, to good purpose. His property in money amounted to nearly £3,000. Of this he bequeathed the interest of £1,000 to Mr Peggotty for his life, and on his decease the principal to be equally divided between Peggotty, little Emily, and me, or the survivor or survivors of us, share and share alike. All the rest he died possessed of he bequeathed to Peggotty, whom he left residuary legatee and sole executrix of that his last will and testament. I felt myself quite a proctor when I read this document aloud with all possible ceremony, and set forth its provisions any number of times to those whom they concerned. I began to think that there was more in the commons than I had supposed. I examined the will with the deepest attention, pronounced it perfectly formal in all respects, made a pencil mark or two in the margin, and thought it rather extraordinary that I knew so much. In this abstruse pursuit, in making an account for Peggotty of all the property into which she had come, in arranging all the affairs in an orderly manner, and in being her referee and adviser on every point, to our joint delight, I passed a week before the funeral. I did not see little Emily in that interval, but they told me she was to be quietly married in a fortnight. I did not attend the funeral in character, if I may venture to say so. I mean I was not dressed up in a black coat and a streamer to frighten the birds, but I walked over to Blunderstone early in the morning, and was in the churchyard when it came, attended only by Peggotty and her brother. The mad gentleman looked on out of my little window. Mr Chillip's baby wagged its heavy head, and rolled its goggle eyes at the clergyman over its nurse's shoulder. Mr Omer breathed short in the background. No one else was there, and it was very quiet. We walked about the churchyard for an hour after all was over, and pulled some young leaves from the tree above my mother's grave. A dread falls on me here. A cloud is lowering on the distant town, towards which I retraced my solitary steps. I fear to approach it. I cannot bear to think of what did come upon that memorable night, of what must come again if I go on. It is no worse because I write of it. It would be no better if I stopped my most unwilling hand. It is done. Nothing can undo it. Nothing can make it otherwise than it was. My old nurse was to go to London with me next day on the business of the will. Little Emily was passing that day at Mr Omer's. We were all to meet in the old boat house that night. Ham would bring Emily at the usual hour. I would walk back at my leisure. The brother and sister would return as they had come, and be expecting us, when the day had closed in, at the fireside. I parted from them at the wicket gate where visionary Strap had rested with Roderick Random's knapsack in the days of yore, and instead of going straight back, walked a little distance on the road to Lowestoft. Then I turned and walked back towards Yarmouth. I stayed to dine at a decent alehouse, some mile or two from the ferry I had mentioned before, and thus the day wore away, and it was evening when I reached it. The rain was falling heavily by that time, and it was a wild night, but there was a moon behind the clouds, and it was not dark. I was soon within sight of Mr Peggotty's house, and of the light within it shining through the window. A little floundering across the sand, which was heavy, brought me to the door, and I went in. It looked very comfortable indeed. Mr Peggotty had smoked his evening pipe, and there were preparations for some supper by and by. The fire was bright, the ashes were thrown up, the locker was ready for little Emily in her old place. In her old place sat Peggotty once more, looking, but for her dress, as if she had never left it. She had fallen back already on the society of the work-box with St Paul's upon the lid, the yard measure in the cottage, and the bit of wax candle, and there they all were, just as if they had never been disturbed. Mrs Gummidge appeared to be fretting a little in her old corner, and consequently looked quite natural too. "You're first of the lot, Master Davy," said Mr Peggotty with a happy face. "Don't keep in that coat, sir, if it's wet." "Thank you, Mr Peggotty," said I, giving him my outer coat to hang up. "It's quite dry." So 'tis, said Mr. Peggotty, feeling my shoulders, as a chip. Sit ye down, sir. It ain't no use saying welcome to you, but you're welcome, kind and hearty. Thank you, Mr. Peggotty, I am sure of that. Well, Peggotty, said I, giving her a kiss, and how are you, old woman? Ha ha! Laughed Mr. Peggotty, sitting down beside us, and rubbing his hands in his sense of relief from recent trouble, and in the genuine heartiness of his nature. There's not a woman in the world, sir, as I tell her, that need to feel more easy in her mind than her. She's done her duty by the departed, and the departed knowed it, and the departed done what was right by her, as she done what was right by the departed, and it's all right. Mrs. Gummidge groaned. Cheer up, my pretty Martha, said Mr. Peggotty, but he shook his head aside at us, evidently sensible of the tendency of the late occurrences to recall the memory of the old one. Don't be down. Cheer up, for your own self. Only a little bit, and see if a good deal more don't come natural. Not to me, Dan'l, returned Mrs. Gummidge. Nothing's natural to me but to be lone and lorn. No, no, said Mr. Peggotty, soothing her sorrows. Yes, Dan'l, said Mrs. Gummidge. I ain't a person to live with them as has had money left. Things go contrary with me. I had better be a riddance. Why, how should I ever spend it without you? Said Mr. Peggotty, with an air of serious remonstrance. What are you a-talking on? Don't I want you more now than I ever did? I know there was never wanted before, cried Mrs. Gummidge, with a pitiable whimper, and now I'm told so. How could I expect to be wanted, being so lone and lorn and so contrary? Mr. Peggotty seemed very much shocked at himself for having made a speech capable of this unfeeling construction, but was prevented from replying by Peggotty's pulling his sleeve and shaking her head. After looking at Mrs. Gummidge for some moments in sore distress of mind, he glanced at the Dutch clock, rose, snuffed the candle, and put it in the window. There, said Mr. Peggotty cheerily. There we are, Mrs. Gummidge. Mrs. Gummidge slightly groaned. Lighted up according to custom. You're a wondering what's that for, sir? Well, 'tis for our little Emily. You see, the path ain't over light or cheerful after dark, and when I'm here at the hour and she's a-coming home, I puts a light in the winder. That, you see, said Mr. Peggotty, bending over me with great glee, meets two objects. She says Emily, there's home, she says. And likewise, says Emily, my uncle's there, for if I ain't there, I never have no light showed. You're a baby, said Peggotty, very fond of him for it, if she thought so. Well, returned Mr. Peggotty, standing with his legs pretty wide apart, and rubbing his hands up and down them in his comfortable satisfaction, as he looked alternately at us and at the fire. I don't know but I am, not you see to look at. Not exactly, observed Peggotty. No, laughed Mr. Peggotty, not to look at, but to consider on, you know. I don't care, bless you. Now, I tell you, when I go a-looking and a-looking about that there pretty house of our Emily's, I'm gormed, said Mr. Peggotty with sudden emphasis. There, I can't say more if I don't feel as if the littlest of things was her almost. I takes 'em up and I puts 'em down, and I touches of 'em as delicate as if they was our Emily. So 'tis with her little bonnets and that. I couldn't see one on 'em rough used on purpose, not for the whole world. There's a babby for you, in the form of a great sea porcupine, said Mr. Peggotty, relieving his earnestness with a roar of laughter. Peggotty and I both laughed, but not so loud. It's my opinion, you see, said Mr. Peggotty, with a delighted face, after some further rubbing of his legs, as this is along of my having played with her so much, and made believe as we was Turks and French and sharks and every variety of foreigners, bless ye, yes, and lions and whales, and I don't know what all, when she warn't no higher than my knee, and I got into the way on it, you know. Why, this here candle now, said Mr. Peggotty, gleefully holding out his hand towards it, I know very well that after she's married and gone, I shall put that candle there just the same as now. I know very well that when I'm here o' nights, and where else should I live, bless your hearts, whatever fortune I come into, and she ain't here or I ain't there, I shall put the candle in the winder and sit afore the fire pretending I'm expecting of her, like I'm a-doing now. "There's a babby for you," said Mr. Peggotty with another roar, "in the form of a sea porkypine. Why, at the present minute, when I see the candle sparkle up, I says to myself, she's a looking at it, Emily's a coming. There's a babby for you, in the form of a sea porkypine. Right for all that," said Mr. Peggotty, stopping in his roar, and smiting his hands together, "for here she is." It was only Ham. The night should have turned more wet since I came in, for he had a large sou'wester hat on, slouched over his face. "Where's Emily?" said Mr. Peggotty. Ham made a motion with his head, as if she were outside. Mr. Peggotty took the light from the window, trimmed it, put it on the table, and was busily stirring the fire, when Ham, who had not moved, said, "Master Davy, will you come out a minute, and see what Emily and me has got to show you?" We went out. As I passed him at the door, I saw, to my astonishment and fright, that he was deathly pale. He pushed me hastily into the open air, and closed the door upon us. Only upon us two. "Ham, what's the matter?" "Oh, Master Davy!" Oh, for his broken heart! How dreadfully he wept! I was paralysed by the sight of such grief. I don't know what I thought, or what I dreaded. I could only look at him. "Ham, poor good fellow, for heaven's sake, tell me what's the matter." "My love, Master Davy, the pride and hope of my heart, her that I'd have died for, that I would die for now, she's gone." "Gone?" "Emily's run away. Oh, Master Davy, think how she's run away, when I pray my good and gracious God to kill her, her that is so dear above all things, sooner than let her come to ruin and disgrace." The face he turned up to the troubled sky, the quivering of his clasped hands, the agony of his figure, remain associated with that lonely waste in my remembrance to this hour. It is always night there, and he is the only object in the scene. "You're a scholar," he said hurriedly, "and know what's right and best. What am I to say indoors? How am I ever to break it to him, Master Davy?" I saw the door move, and instinctively tried to hold the latch on the outside, to gain a moment's time. It was too late. Mr. Peggotty thrust forth his face, and never could I forget the change that came upon it when he saw us, if I were to live 500 years. I remember a great wail and cry, and the women hanging about him, and we all standing in the room, I with a paper in my hand, which Ham had given me, Mr. Peggotty with his vest torn open, his hair wild, his face and lips quite white, and blood trickling down his bosom, it had sprung from his mouth, I think, looking fixedly at me. "Read it, sir," he said in a low shivering voice. "Slow, please. I don't know as I can understand." In the midst of the silence of death, I read thus from a blotted letter. "When you, who love me so much better than I ever deserved, even when my mind was innocent, see this, I shall be far away." "I shall be far away," he repeated slowly. "Stop, Emily, far away. Well. When I leave my dear home, oh, my dear home, in the morning." The letter bore date on the previous night. "It will be never to come back, unless he brings me back a lady. This will be found at night, many hours after, instead of me. Oh, if you only knew how my heart is torn! If even you, that I have wronged so much, that never can forgive me, could only know what I suffer! I am too wicked to write about myself. Oh, take comfort in thinking that I am so bad. Oh, for mercy's sake, tell uncle that I never loved him half so dear as now. Oh, don't remember how affectionate and kind you have all been to me. Don't remember we were ever to be married, but try to think as if I died when I was little, and was buried somewhere. Pray heaven that I am going away from, have compassion upon my uncle. Tell him that I never loved him half so dear. Be his comfort. Love some good girl that will be what I was once to uncle, and be true to you, and worthy of you, and know no shame but me. God bless all. I'll pray for all often on my knees. If he don't bring me back a lady, and I don't pray for myself, I'll pray for all. My parting love to uncle, my last tears, my last thanks for uncle." That was all. He stood long after I had ceased to read, still looking at me. At length I ventured to take his hand, and to entreat him, as well as I could, to endeavour to get some command of himself. He replied, "I thank ye, sir, I thank ye," without moving. Ham spoke to him. Mr. Peggotty was so far sensible of his affliction, that he wrung his hand, but otherwise he remained in the same state, and no one dared to disturb him. Slowly at last he moved his eyes from my face, as if he were waking from a vision, and cast them around the room. Then he said in a low voice, "Who's the man? I want to know his name." Ham glanced at me, and suddenly I felt a shock that struck me back. "There's a man suspected," said Mr. Peggotty. "Who is it?" "Master Davy," implored Ham, "go out a bit, and let me tell him what I must. You doing ought to hear it, sir." I felt the shock again. I sank down in a chair and tried to utter some reply, but my tongue was fettered and my sight was weak. "I want to know his name," I heard said once more. "For some time past," Ham faltered, "there's been a servant about here, at odd times. There's been a gentleman too. Both of them belong to one another." Mr. Peggotty stood fixed as before, but now looking at him. "The servant," pursued Ham, "was seen along with our poor girl last night. He's been in hiding about here this week or over. He was thought to have gone, but he was hiding. Don't stay, Master Davy, don't." I felt Peggotty's arm around my neck, but I could not have moved if the house had been about to fall upon me. "A strange shay and hosses was outside town this morning, on the Norwich road, almost afore day broke," Ham went on. "The servant went to it, and came from it, and went to it again. When he went to it again, Emily was nigh him. T'other was inside. He's the man." "For the Lord's love," said Mr. Peggotty, falling back, and putting out his hand as if to keep off what he dreaded, "don't tell me his name's Steerforth." "Master Davy," exclaimed Ham in a broken voice, "it ain't no fault of yourn, and I am far from laying of it to you. But his name is Steerforth, and he's a damned villain." Mr. Peggotty uttered no cry, and shed no tear, and moved no more, until he seemed to wake again all at once, and pulled down his rough coat from its peg in a corner. "Bear a hand with this. I'm struck of a heap, and I can't do it," he said impatiently. "Bear a hand and help me. Well." When somebody had done so, "Now give me that there hat." Ham asked him whither he was going. "I'm a-going to seek my niece. I'm a-going to seek my Emily. I'm a-going first to stave that there boat, and sink it where I would have drowned him, as I'm a living soul, if I had had one thought of what was in him, as he sat afore me," he said wildly, holding out his clenched right hand. "As he sat afore me, face to face, strike me down dead, but I'd have drowned him, and thought it right. I'm a-going to seek my niece." "Where?" cried Ham, interposing himself before the door. "Anywhere. I'm a-going to seek my niece through the world. I'm a-going to find my poor niece in her shame, and bring her back. No one stop me. I tell you, I'm a-going to seek my niece." "No, no," cried Mrs. Gummidge, coming between them in a fit of crying. "No, no, Dan'l, not as you are now. Seek her in a little while, my lone lorn, Dan'l, and that'll be but right, but not as you are now. Sit ye down and give me your forgiveness for having ever been a worrit to you. Dan'l, what have my contraries ever been to this? And let us speak a word about them times when she was first an orphan, and when Ham was too, and when I was a poor widow woman, and you took me in. It'll soften your poor heart, Dan'l," laying her head upon his shoulder, "and you'll bear your sorrow better, for you know the promise, Dan'l. As you have done it unto one of the least of these, you have done it unto me. And that can never fail under this roof that's been our shelter for so many, many year." He was quite passive now, and when I heard him crying, the impulse that had been upon me to go down upon my knees, and ask their pardon for the desolation I had caused, and curse Steerforth, yielded to a better feeling. My overcharged heart found the same relief, and I cried too. Chapter 31